It's my pleasure today to introduce Daniel Lambach, whose article is the winner of the Review of International Studies annual prize for the best article in Review of International Studies in volume 48, and that's 2022. Daniel is a Heisenberg Fellow at the Normative Orders Research Center at Goethe Universität Frankfurt. And he publishes on space, governance, the global commons, and digital sovereignty. And he describes himself as having a particular focus on the politics of digital spaces and how the state is transforming and being transformed by digitalization. And Daniel's article, Space, Scale, and Global Politics Towards a Critical Approach to Space in International Relations, was published in Review of International Studies, volume 48, number 2, and you can find a link in the notes accompanying this video. And the article argues for a fuller engagement of IR scholars with socio-spatial concepts and proposes a spatial approach to global politics based on 4 essential dimensions: a spatial ontology, the constructedness of space, a scalar perspective, and the interaction of materiality and ideas. And the article then elaborates the framework of spatial practices and uses the example of Arctic security research to illustrate the value of this spatial approach for IR. The prize judges, we have an editorial board panel of judges, and they noted that this is a well-written article that addresses an important conceptual issue relevant to many different areas of IR scholarship. The author engages with and effectively translates relevant work in geography, sociology, and anthropology to present an easily accessible yet sophisticated heuristic model that advances our ability to theorize and analyze spatial questions. The approach expands our spatial vocabulary beyond territory to acknowledge alternative spatial forms, for example, place, scale, network, body, and landscape. And it encourages inquiry about how different forms of space emerge, are reinforced, and interact in a given context. I think importantly, they also noted that throughout the manuscript, Lambach acknowledges the pluralism of contemporary IR with both explicit and implicit references to many different theoretical perspectives and substantive fields. And I think that's quite important for review insofar as this is an article that speaks to many different traditions of thinking about international relations. So welcome and congratulations, Daniel. And I wondered if I could start with a question about what led you to write about the topic. How did you become interested in critical approaches to space?
Thanks, Martin. I'm obviously very gratified to receive this award and happy to have this little conversation here. So how did I get here? I started my work on failed and fragile states, and you will recall that this was a very big thing in the 2000s. And for these states, territorial control was always argued as being absolutely crucial into transforming into more consolidated ones. At the same time, here in Europe, we had this big wave of austerity politics, which argued for, slimming down the state, but somehow territorial control never got mentioned in these debates. So it seemed to me that we have this differentiated regime of territoriality. And it opened my eyes to how territory isn't just something that is out there, but something that is produced. And that led me to reading works from critical geography like John Agnew or Stuart Eldon or Doreen Massey, and then realizing that they've been having some conversations that are very approachable to someone from IR who's done some work on or who has read some social constructivism. So they seem to be having similar conversations, but from going into a different direction that seemed kind of productive in bringing these two impressions together.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of you really bring that sort of tradition of critical thinking in geography about space into IR really well to think about this kind of production of territoriality. So I wonder, could you tell us what the sort of main arguments are about space that you make in the article?
Well, in very simple terms, the key argument is that space is more than the container of the social. It's not just the stage that actors act on or something like that. And you did mention sort of the key theoretical points about the ontology, the social constructiveness, the scales, and materiality and ideas. And I think my proposal would be to think of space as a set of practices, how it's reified, how meaning is inscribed, how boundedness is communicated, and how it's related to other spaces. And I think importantly, space is not a singular approach, and it can be sort of put into more concrete terms by applying different spatial ontologies, as I borrow the term from the geographers, by asking about territory or place or scale or network or body or landscape. Not everything, has to be a network, and I'm sure you will agree with that on me.
Yeah, no, in my own work, I've thought about networks as a particular kind of discursive practice. I think this kind of question of practice brings along with it questions of politics. And I wonder if you want to kind of tell us a little bit about sort of how the article can help us understand the politics of space in international relations.
Well, it does make space sort of the object of research, sort of moving it from the sidelines into the center of the conversation. And I think international relations, in as much as we can talk about it as a singular discipline and, examples notwithstanding, should think about it more thoroughly, because everything has a spatial dimension. I love this quote by Barney Whorf and Santa Arias: "Where things happen is critical to knowing how and why they happen." And I think a spatial approach is useful in thinking how materiality and ideas interact in shaping political structures and political outcomes. And I think it opens up creative possibilities. Almost 30 years ago now, John Agnew said IR is stuck in this territorial trap of always thinking of space in terms of territory. And I think things have become better since then, but we haven't really got over it. So we're still sort of in this trap. So I think my article offers suggestions how to move beyond that. By sort of relating these different ontologies to each other, we can talk about, how are they linked? Where are the tensions? And for instance, when I was writing a different article on territory and cyberspace, it was very evident that there is this network topography, but cyberspace always treated as a set of territories. And there are evident tensions between these two approaches that a spatial approach can help us bring out.
Yeah, and I think especially conceptualizing it as a practice that materializes particular kinds of arrangements of political kind of power or governance. I think you do that really effectively in the article. So could you tell us a little bit about how you use this framework to think about the various approaches to thinking about Arctic security in the article?
Yes, I did use Arctic security because I think it's a very useful example, because we have, on the one hand, these changing spatialities of the Arctic, moving beyond the Cold War framework, changing environmental conditions, an emergence of regional politics, but also the political activism of indigenous communities. So there's a lot happening there, and I think a spatial approach is useful in relating these to each other: the changing material conditions, the changing discourses, and the multiple scales which politics is occurring there. And in the article, I do a very brief survey of works using different ontologies. So state attempts to create new territories and boundaries, sort of the scalar embeddedness of Arctic politics and global politics, but also the body as a site of military research and the like.
Yeah, and I think this kind of, you bring out really well the kind of the different scales there, so that it's not just about the social production of space, but it's also about thinking about how space has different scales, and that kind of really really kind of is embedded or intertwined with the different types of practices that it encompasses. I wonder, that kind of looking at space, can we apply that to more contemporary examples? I'm thinking here, like, kind of what we would often think of as kind of classic territorial disputes, like, for example, sort of Russia, Ukraine, for example. Can we see those in different kinds of lights through your framework?
Yes, of course. And Russia, Ukraine, I think, is a very rich example. For instance, we could use it to elaborate different spatial approaches to just enrich the discussion, not replace all the other analysis. First of all, we can look at space as environment there, so terrain as an operational space for war fighting, or logistical networks, or spatial contiguity, this importance of the Russian land bridge to Crimea or Belarus as a secondary deployment area. So I think these are very important material concerns that a spatial approach could elucidate. Or we could look to space as idea and discourse, so Russian imperial imaginaries or discourses of Ukrainian nationhood and the role of the Crimea in both of these, or the female body as territory and rape as a weapon of war. And thirdly, we can look at space as a political construction, so Russian ideas of a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space, or these supposed independent republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, or problems of Ukrainian state building, or the roles of internal peripheries. So I think a spatial approach makes it possible to bring these different aspects of space into the conversation, and also bring them into conversation with each other. For example, We look at how spatial imaginaries inform military behavior on the ground, or how military successes and failures are narrated with reference to geopolitical visions.
Yeah, and I think, I think personally, there's the strength of the article is the way in which it shows that there's a much richer conversation to be had about space. Confining it to territory is far too flat and simplistic, and this kind of rich imbrication of different sort of scales and practices, I think, is really kind of the key contribution of the article.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just ask you one kind of final question? So, what are you working on now?
Yeah, I want to highlight three things here. The first is I want to talk about the concept of post-globalization, because I think globalization is being renegotiated, and in short, interdependence is vulnerability now, and that sort of implies a new spatial order of the global. Secondly, the work on space sort of led me to work on technology as well, because technology plays an important role how we view space, how we represent space, and how we deal with space, especially those spaces that are beyond sort of the familiar terrain of land. And that led me to work on digital sovereignty and the global politics of AI. And at the intersection of all of the above, basically, is something recently where I started talking about, or thinking about, global critical infrastructures. Because the idea of critical infrastructure is always constructed on a national scale as something that serves national societies. But given, the Anthropocene, what are the critical infrastructures of all of humanity? And how are they governed, and how should they be governed? That's still a very early stage, but I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out.
Well, they sound really interesting. We look forward to reading the work when it's published. So congratulations again. Well done on winning the prize. It's richly deserved. I can recommend everybody reads Daniel's article. You can find the link in the notes for this interview. Thank you very much, Daniel.
Thank you.